Hey everyone, my name is Eliza, and before we begin, I'd love to start with an acknowledgement to country on behalf of myself and all of our Halad team members here today, being Sarah, Karim and Vera, who you'll meet shortly. So I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we work and live, that being Melbourne here for us, in which the traditional custodians are the Wurundjeri people. And I also acknowledge all the Indigenous people from the lands on which you might be connecting with us here today, whether that be on Australian soil or not. I also pay my respects to our elders, all past, present and emerging. So thank you for joining me in our acknowledgement to country before we begin, and I'd love to welcome you to our mini mock number 2 in our series of 3 exams here today. So if you have read through, open up the chat tab and you'll be able to see the instructions. Since the last mini mock, I think you all now know that the September sitting will be online. So you will, most likely like the May sitting, you'll have paper. So make sure that you do have that accessible to you and you've set yourself up correctly. So once you're all ready with your earphones in, preferably, so that you can hear the timer go off, please put a thumbs up or an indication that you're ready on the chat. So type the word ready, just so that we know we're ready to go. But whilst you guys get yourselves set up, I might just give you a bit of an introduction to Halad. And if you've already heard this because you've been part of mini mock 1, I'll just do a refresher for you. So if you're not from Melbourne, you might not have heard of Halad. So yes, we are a not-for-profit out of Melbourne. And very much what we do is go to some of the most rural communities in the south of the Philippines. Our partner community is called Valencia City in the south here, and we take Australian university students on a 2-week volunteering trip to be able to teach some of the most important health topics. And so essentially all our GAMSAT tuition is able to fund those mission trips, is what we call them, to allow sort of more volunteers to be able to go and teach more students, which has been incredible to see. And I guess the insane thing for us to say is really that it does make a huge social impact. And for the May cohort that has come through our GAMSAT tuition services in the last few months, they were able to raise over $10,000 through just taking the GAMSAT course with us. And for that, I will always say, we have immense gratitude to all the students who come through our GAMSAT sort of program, because it very much are sort of those early students in those early days who support us, who do make a world of difference, and are the pioneers of sort of the GAMSAT program that we have now. And I guess in a way of being able to say our gratitudes to those students and to be able to say thank you, the only way we can do that best is to pay it forward and make a better course for September. So that's exactly what we're trying to do now. If you haven't met me yet, my name is Eliza. I'm the co-founder and managing director here at Halad, which basically means that, as I've had the privilege of working with this team of incredibly smart GAMSAT team. I have not taken the GAMSAT myself, so I basically sit behind the scenes, manning the chat and making sure that your questions do get answered. So maybe don't ask me the GAMSAT questions, but more so the tutors themselves. Next we have Sarah, who's here today. If you've been to any of our mini mocks, you've probably met Sarah before. Sarah is the incredible brains behind Halad's GAMSAT and also a section 1 and 2 tutor, and is in her MD3 at Monash, which is insane. And if you know anything about Sarah, she is 100% the type of tutor who wants to get you into medicine more than you probably do yourself. And she takes so much joy in just seeing students progress and improve. And we also have Vera join us today, who is one of our section 2 markers. Vera has actually been one of the students who has taken the first online GAMSAT this May coming through, and has a ton of experience on how to really adapt those studying strategies to an online exam. So if you have any questions for that aspect of the sort of technical side of how to prepare for an online exam, feel free to shoot your questions in the chat to Vera, and I'm sure she'll respond to you via the chat during the exam. And we have Karim, who is our section 3 tutor and an MD1 at Melbourne. And I probably have never seen someone who's more hardworking of a studier than Karim himself, and is an absolute bio whiz. So when we get to section 3, he'll take you through that. So I guess I always have this slide and I'll always have this slide on. And I guess the reason why we have this now is because we've realized very much through this May GAMSAT, the reason why students improving their scores by 10, 20, 23 points at a time, which is absolutely insane, is very much because of the philosophy we have behind teaching GAMSAT. It's definitely not about just the score. And I think our philosophy is all about having the bigger picture in mind. We definitely don't mentor students who just want incredible GAMSAT scores, but we definitely do mentor students who want to become incredible medical professionals. And now being able to have gone through a GAMSAT season with so many students who have signed up and seeing their results now, those two things are definitely very different. And I think what speaks words and loads to that sentiment is an email that Sarah received from one of the students who did incredibly well. And in her sort of response back after she got her incredible results, I just wanted to read this out. It says, "I feel like I learnt from you more than just techniques for the exam, but also a new way of thinking and conversing with people. Whenever I received corrections from you at 2 a.m, and I still don't know how that happens, and when I talk to you about medicine, I sense the level of commitment and passion you have. And from this, I see what kind of energy is required from a doctor. Thanks for allowing us to get to know you. Even though I won't miss GAMSAT preparations, I will miss your lessons." And I think that speaks more to sort of the actual mindset to have going into the exam, and the mindset hopefully you get out of doing the exam, and gets you more and more excited about getting that step closer into med or dentistry school for you. So that's just a reminder for when you actually are doing the content and the questions, which you'll be doing 2 hours of straight from here, to always have that bigger perspective of being in those shoes and that energy of having, of being a doctor. So just a quick rundown. For the first section 1, you'll have 15 minutes to do 10 questions. I will give you the question book and the submission book as a link in the chat. I suggest that you have them open side by side so you can answer as you go. Then Sarah will lead you in 15 minutes of an explanation. And meanwhile, make sure you submit when the time is up, so then I can include and tally all of your results into a live cohort sort of results. And you'll be able to see how you performed. We'll go straight into section 2. Here for the 20 minutes, how much do you want everyone to write on this prompt, Sarah?
Yep, so minimum if you can write an intro or your equivalent of that, and 1 paragraph. If you can get 2 in or write some sort of conclusive statement, that would be fantastic as well. I'll give you a tiny bit more before section 2 just in case you've never done it before.
Perfect, cool. I should remember to put that in next time. And then Vera will take you through the explanation of that prompt, plus we'll pick one student's response at random through the form that you've submitted. We won't put the name on it, but there is a checkbox at the bottom of that form that basically says, are you happy for us to use your example as the live feedback sample essay? So if you're happy for that to be, make sure you tick yes so that Vera can pick the right ones. And then we'll hop into section 3. You'll have 20 minutes to do 10 questions. And don't worry if you are rushing for time for that one. It is quite difficult. And then Karim will do 20 minutes of full explanations. And again, you'll get live cohort results. And then we'll just finish up with some reflection. So make sure in the chat you let us know that you're ready to go. Otherwise, I'll hand back over to Sarah and we'll start the exam.
Just while Laz is grabbing that link for all of you, you'll have 15 minutes. Like she said, I'll keep this timer up on the screen. I'll let you know when you've got a minute to go as well. Just in case you haven't had much exposure to the GAMSAT before, section 1 is basically some texts to read, and then answer the questions. They'll all be multi-choice and you'll have 4 options, A through D, and we'll go over them together afterwards. All right, so yeah, just put in the chat, just put a yes or put a thumbs up on the Zoom when you've got those links up, and we'll start the timer. Okay, great. So I'm going to spend the next 15-ish minutes going over some of the questions and also just giving some general tips and advice with section 1, particularly the text types that were in the mini mock today. So firstly, if you just look at this slide, this has sort of a breakdown of how you all went. So it looks like you did really well. A median of 6 is fantastic. And I'm going to go over each sort of text, and I'll also point out the questions that people found the most difficult. So we'll start with the proverbs. Also, if you have questions along the way, you can put them in the chat. But also, if there are any that I haven't fully gone over or that you want to keep the explanations for, we'll send you this document afterwards so that you can review how you went and review the questions and texts. So in terms of proverbs, these don't come up an awful lot in section 1. They usually are only 2 to 3 questions on them, but they're easy marks if you know how to do them. So my advice would be to break down the proverbs or the sayings or quotes or even definitions. Sometimes they might give you, break them down, put them in your own words or make them relatable to you so that you can understand what's going on. So in this case, they've given you 4 proverbs. And so you can expect that when you're given multiple of something, that you'll need to also compare them at some point. So it's important not to neglect breaking down each one just because there's a lot of them there. So for example, the first one, pearls don't lie on the seashore. If you want one, you must dive for it. First principle of Proverbs being that they'll use some sort of metaphor or something that's quite like commonplace to help you to understand a deeper concept. So working out what that deeper concept is helps out. So in this case, a pearl being something precious and the seashore being something accessible. So the precious things aren't easily accessible on the seashore. If you want those things, you have to put in the effort. And so now that you've broken down the prompt and broken down the proverb and understood it for yourself, you know that this proverb is about working hard to get what you want rather than just being entitled or expecting to get something. So that would be my first recommendation, is to break them down so that you know what is actually going on in each one. So I'm just going to scroll to each question breakdown. Great. So it looks like with the Proverbs, question 3 was the hardest, but question 1 and 2 went pretty well. So I might just go to question 3 in terms of which 2 quotes are alike. And I think that this one's a really nice one because definitely you can get asked to compare things. And also it gets you to think about which ones are most sort of, or which ones, when you break them down, have a key lesson that matches. So the first one being you have to work hard for something if you want it. And then the second one being that going through something difficult brings knowledge or brings wisdom. The third one, a rolling stone gathers no moss. This one people can find difficult to work out. It looks like you all nailed it with question 2. But basically means that by moving along at something, you're able to leave behind responsibilities and not get bogged down by a lot of things and a lot of chaos. And then the last one, popular beliefs on essential matters must be examined in order to discover the original thought. And so you need to spend time looking for the wisdom and looking for the right things and looking for or going through what's going on so that you can actually understand. And so you have to dive in deeper to find that pearl. Looking at these, options 1 or option A, so Proverbs 1 and 2, are also quite similar. I would say that the key difference is that 1 and 4 don't necessarily say that you have to go through an adversity or something difficult. You more just have to apply yourself, as opposed to number 2 being specifically about going through something hard. However, if you chose A, that also matches closely, just not as closely as option D. And this is very critical in how section 1 works, is that often you can get it down to 2 options which match nicely, and then picking between the other 2 involves just a little bit of extra thinking about which ones are most closely related. All right, so the poem, let's see how people went. Probably question 6 was the hardest on the poem. Yeah. All right. So, a couple of things about poetry. Poetry can be very varied in section 1. You can get anything from a very short poem called an epigram. You can get a sort of Shakespearean Old English style poem. You can get something that rhymes. You can get something that doesn't. It's fair game. They can give you just about anything. In poetry in section 1, my recommendation would be to learn a little bit about literary conventions that are commonly used in poems. Section 1 isn't really a test checking how much English or literature you know, but definitely can help to know some of those things. So, for example, knowing that this poem, it doesn't really have a lot of rhyme, but it has a lot of metaphor. And so helping you to understand, or knowing how to understand and interpret metaphors, can be really beneficial. So, when I read a poem for this section, I always try to make sure that I know what it's about. So, I would recommend, because this poem is sort of split into stanzas, so it's got 3, that each stanza I've interpreted before I attempt the questions. Some of my students like to read the questions first. That's perfectly fine. You're welcome to do that. But still, before you actually sorry. Still, before you actually lock in an option as being your answer, you should be able to interpret what is going on in each part of the poem. So, hopefully, you all came to the conclusion or the understanding that this poem is about soldiers at war and that they died. And there's a lot of symbolism and metaphor in this poem. So, it's actually not overly clear whether the soldiers being shipped away and sent out to sea and then being lost at sea is literally what's happening, or whether them being like lost to the seafloor is a metaphor for them dying in the war. It's never given away to you. And so just like be careful if you read a poem and its metaphor and imagery is so strong that you genuinely don't know whether it's literal anymore or whether it's using a lot of metaphor to teach you something. And so the key here is whether or not they physically drowned at sea or whether they actually died on a battlefield doesn't overly matter, because this poem is more about war and how it leads to death, and about how these soldiers died in the war, and also about what life means to them, and that because they died at war, they've actually been freed from the war, but also because they died at the war, they've understood this continuity of life, such as the sea, them being on the seafloor, and the sea creatures benefiting off of them being on the seafloor. And so it creates this cyclical nature. So my sort of lesson there is, if you're not 100% sure if something in a poem or in any text in this section is doing one thing or the other, sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it's not actually going to change how you answer the questions. So I think I'll go to question 6 first, because I think that was the most challenging one. What is the writer trying to say here with lines 5 to 8? So I'll just go back to those lines and just read them out. The thrashing storm that caught us cracked the hulls and made us offerings to the seafloor, a rain of statues, golden men. And so I think like this is what I was saying about whether the poem is very literal and they actually were lost at sea, or whether it's a metaphor for the fact that they were in battle and they didn't make it. Either way, it's saying that the soldiers died. So that's the first part. The soldiers have been defeated in battle, which makes a resounding correct. But also there are some that look very tempting here. For example, this option here, the sea full of chaos and death is similar to war. This is a really tempting option because the whole poem relies on this metaphor about the sea. When you get confused about these things, take a step back and ask yourself, okay, even though it is talking about the sea, what's it saying about the sea? And it's not so much that it's saying that the sea itself is full of chaos and death, or saying that the sea is similar to war. It's saying that the soldier's death is similar to the sea, or being lost in the sea. So it's not really saying that the sea is the war itself. It's saying that like the sea can represent like this death and this like sort of juxtaposition of life and death and that play out of it, which doesn't necessarily have to happen in war. It can happen in all sorts of things, including sailors being lost out at sea and all sorts of elements there. So if you're a bit stuck with a metaphor, like if you feel like you're getting like entrenched in a metaphor that has been presented to you in a poem, my recommendation would be take a step back and ask yourself, what's the point of the metaphor? In this case, the point of the metaphor is to be able to help you interpret the death of the soldiers rather than help you interpret war itself. And when I do that, it helps me with those sort of like finer details, those nitty gritty parts, which can be really difficult to comprehend and to navigate in this section. The other one that I wanted to go through was, sorry, this one. Sorry, I'm just looking for, the final paragraph one. Yeah. So question 7. Yep, which looks like a fair few of you got. 33 of you got correct. But this one just really emphasizes that point I was just making about like reading the whole stanza or reading the whole poem, working out what its key components are and what its key message is. So this one's asking what's the message of the final paragraph. Really common question is to ask you to interpret a message of part or all of the text. So this one basically talks about how their bodies were lying there and then the animals sort of made use of their bodies. And so the reason why I like this question is if you go back down to question 7, you have options B and D, which both sort of take elements from that paragraph. And D probably could have even teased it a little bit further and said something like the benefit animals have off of the dead, or something even, I guess, more literal. The reason why the answer is B and not D for this one, though, resides on A, the whole theme of the poem, but also B, this final line, so we are still of use, gives you or orients you to the whole paragraph, basically showing you that not only is this what's happening to their dead bodies, whether it's literal or a metaphor, it's also that the way that they think about that is, well, that's a good thing because we're still of use. So it's understanding that the cycle of life is far more than just the individual. It means that even beyond the grave, they're still useful and they're still part of this cycle. So you can also look for sort of key elements to help you know what's going on in the text. Okay. Amazing. So I'm just going to go through one more and then I'll quickly show you guys cohort results and then we'll move on to section 2. So visual texts are super common. They are not, they won't give you many of them. You might get 1, maybe 2 in the section, but they're really nice ones because they don't take a lot of time to look at. And usually there's 2 or 3 questions attached to them, which can be really good to get you some marks. But they don't give them too easy. They usually give you ones that are quite convoluted or can have double meanings. So this one I thought was a really good example of that. So my advice is always take some time to interpret the cartoon, and every cartoon or visual text will have a message. So it will have like a message or a lesson. Some of them will be funny, some of them won't. If they are meant to be humorous, see if you can also work out why it's humorous. So why is it funny? What's the joke? So this one here, the message of it is simply that we've got this, or I sort of, to get myself to the message, I ask myself what's happening. So we've got a woman and she's sort of, you can see from age 14 that expression that she's not feeling too great about herself. She's looking down at her chest, so that's what she's insecure about. And you can see the reason why she's insecure about it is because when she has a bigger chest at age 20, she's happy. But then in this frame here, this guy steps in and goes, actually, jokes, no, we don't care much about that anymore. We like butts now. And if you look at this, it's just like, ugh. And so I think that this is quite relatable in terms of standards and not being like quite good enough, which can make A look really attractive. But the reason why A isn't the answer is because of this critical component of this frame here, which is that it's a male and that she's deliberately placing her worth on what he's saying rather than if this was like a media article and it was more representing society. So asking yourself, A, what things represent, and also, I also like to ask myself, what would be different about this to make this answer correct? So for example, if A was correct, we'd want this frame to more represent society rather than only representing men. The other one, B, being the control of men over women's satisfaction. This one is a very tempting answer and very close to the truth. The only reason why I wouldn't go with this option is because she was satisfied here. The only reason that she's not satisfied here now is because the actual trend changed. So the trend of actually, no, it's not breasts anymore, it's butts. Now she's like, oh, far out. I just can't get up to that. And so whilst it is a combination of relentless standards and of satisfaction because of what someone else thinks of you, the best one is the fact that when she actually like changed and became happy with who she was, as soon as the trend changed, she wasn't happy anymore. So the greater message here is that her inability to feel comfortable or satisfied in herself had everything to do with the fact that what people wanted wasn't correct anymore or wasn't enough. So this one's a very difficult one, and there are probably different ways to interpret it. But the key message here is taking a step back from it and going, what's the actual cartoon trying to tell me? And what's it? And I guess like the funny part of this is that she achieves something, but then it shifts. So it's not, and I also just like one more little point about this, in terms of relentless standards. If the standard itself was lifting, it would be that, let's say she got her chest to like a certain size and that was meant to be like the ideal, then it increased that again. So it's like, okay, no, that's still not big enough now. It needs to be bigger or it needs to be better, as opposed to it actually shifting to something else. So also looking for small parts like that can be helpful. All right, so one more thing before we move on. Liz, do you have a link for that? Can you just put it in the chat? Thanks. So if everyone wants to jump onto that link, and I'll show it on here as well. We'll just show you how to do this for the first one, and the rest of them, the link you will still send you. But basically you can look across and see what score you got. So let's say that you got 6. The percentile shows you how you went compared to everyone else. So that means 33 percentile, and then it matches up to a predictive GAMSAT score, which is based on this, the curve from the May GAMSAT that we just had, so the most recent GAMSAT. I wouldn't overthink the scores too much because you are a very small sample size, but it's still a good way just to see sort of like how you went or whether you found this a really challenging question set or not. And it helps you to sort of know what things to focus on. All right. So what I'm going to do now is switch screens again, back to the timer. So you'll have 20 minutes for section 2, just a tiny bit before I get you guys started. Just in case you've never done section 2 before, you'll get given a prompt, which is a set of 5 quotes. You need to work out what the overarching theme is of that prompt and then write something for us. And so it doesn't really matter what you write, but if you can write something that's the equivalent to the length of about half of an essay, that would be great. If you'd like to do a conclusive statement, you can just see how you go. But yes, no pressure to finish as such, more just give it a go, explaining your thoughts. And then Vera will go over one of them at random for you all. So if everyone's good to go, if we could just see, great, and you guys can start.
So let's first talk about the theme of this essay, which is a really important part of essay writing. So crucial. You know, you could honestly write a really amazing essay, you know, for instance, about like popular culture and how it has a role in shaping the discourse of racism in our modern day society. And it could be perfect in every single facet, but if it's not quite hitting the mark, you know, if the essay is really talking about pets and you've written an essay about something completely different, unfortunately that essay won't be marked quite as high, which can be quite disappointing. So let's quickly talk about how to break down this prompt. So with any set of GAMSAT prompts, you'd want to make sure that you're actually reading all of the quotes in full. I remember there was one sitting back in 2018 where Asa had quotes which seemingly covered 2 topics, conservation of environment and also what seemed to be family. But if you actually read it in its whole, the family quotes were actually more about population control, which actually fit quite nicely with the whole topic of environment, conserving environment. And I think there were quite a lot of essays written about just the one topic, but writing an essay that doesn't actually overlap with the essay topic given, no matter how good the essay is, you wouldn't get the same marks as you would if you actually wrote an essay to theme. And while I'm reading the quotes, what I would do is I'd probably pay attention to the main theme of each topic, of each quote, and try connecting the dots. And connecting the dots between all the quotes is a really important part. If it helps even, to write 1-word or 2-word summaries of what you think the main essence of each quote is, and kind of looking at your list of words and trying to pick out the main theme that helps you, I would really encourage it. Worst case scenario for me, if I really couldn't identify what the topic for this one was, I would probably try to circle, obviously this is online, but I would probably make a list of the most commonly written word in the quotes, but obviously this would be the worst case scenario. And I would say for this set of prompts, I'm seeing a lot about strength, strength of character, but I'm also seeing a lot on weakness. If we read all the individual quotes, we can definitely see both of those words pop up if that's what you're doing. But we can see that our task B theme here isn't just about integrity of character, you know, inner strength, but it's also about how our weaknesses, such as vulnerability, which is a supposed weakness, actually shapes us in finding our strength. In fact, all of the quotes over here in one way or another actually implicate that our true weaknesses lie in not addressing them. And just with this prompt over here, it's so easy to focus just on strength and ignore the other half of it, which is actually weakness. So I've picked an example essay over here, which I think addressed the topic of weakness and vulnerability quite nicely. And you know, if trying to figure out what the topic is something that you're finding difficulty with, I would recommend even just practicing by yourself if you can locate a set of quotes without even writing an essay, without even writing a plan, but just simply practicing looking at the set of quotes and trying to identify the topic. I would really encourage it. So moving on to our example essay. You guys can see my screen. I think I'll give you guys maybe 2-3 minutes to take a look at the essay, read by yourselves, and then we can jump right into it. Okay, I think that should be enough time for everyone to have read this essay. I did get one question from a student, which I think I might actually address to the whole class over here. And someone has asked me if we expect to address the author's quotes in our responses. And the answer to that is that it's really more of like a stylistic preference. Personally, I never actually addressed any of the authors. I actually can't remember if I even put in the authors of each of the quotes in the actual GAMSAT. I can't quite remember anymore, but it's definitely not something that you have to do. So please don't stress if it's something that you haven't done. Yeah, okay, so let's talk about this essay. Let's start from the introduction. So I think the introduction is a really, really crucial place to actually start establishing the theme straight up, which this the student who has written this obviously has. I like that they've correctly identified the theme as being weakness, and they've talked about this particularly from the angle of the male population, which I think is quite niche. And something that I found that I personally did, and a lot of people find themselves doing, is, I guess, trying to define the topic or trying to define the theme straight up in a very general sense. And I suppose I can understand where it comes from, but it's really nice when you get an essay that's about something more niche in terms of the theme. So this one is particularly talking about mental health weakness, weaknesses in men. Yeah, and I think this is quite good. It's also really important to establish what the main message is. And this is really good for the reader to kind of read it and build up these expectations for what they expect to see in the rest of the essay. And it's quite nice to actually have an essay that flows as you expect. So here we've got the main message, which is that men are continuously expected to excel in keeping emotions at bay, which is something that's quite overlooked by individual members of society. Great idea. Now let's continue into the first paragraph. Yeah, so the person who wrote this essay made a really good point in this first paragraph. I like that they actually referenced one of the quotes which is, as I said before, not entirely necessary, but I think obviously speaks very closely to the theme.
Yeah, so just a couple things about this one and a couple of questions that I might just read out as well. So, exactly like Vera said with that question about whether you can use the quotes or not, just to add to that, you definitely should use the quotes to form some sort of thesis or contention. So, what do I think about this? Which Vera perfectly told you guys it should be about weakness, vulnerability, and if you want to link that to strength or to human character or something along those lines, you can. But don't misinterpret it and just write an essay about strength alone, or just a small part of those quotes. So if you would like to write your essay using the quotes to help you, more than welcome to do that. However, there is a slight issue with if you were using those quotes as each sort of paragraph, because if you just go quote, 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 it's unlikely that they'll match together nicely in terms of actually being able to formulate arguments. So something that's actually worked quite well with this essay is that even though there were 2 quotes used and each, so in terms of using the quotes to help you, I would say to steer away from using a quote per topic sentence per paragraph, because sometimes it can work. It has worked in this case because A, they have sort of expanded on it, and B, they have given a point per one. However, it's more problematic if you pick, okay, quote 1 is going to be paragraph 1, quote 2 is going to be paragraph 2, quote 3 can be paragraph 3, and they don't really link or match each other. The other issue with that is originality. If you're only writing on the quotes, then you're showing that you haven't really thought beyond them. So the good thing about this one is that they've thought a bit beyond and talked about mental health in men, and talked about sort of, emotional displays in men, and that it's sort of seen as a weakness to be emotional, especially if you are male or identify as male. So that's a great point. The only thing that I would say is that in this essay, pushing yourself a bit to use examples or use something that you're familiar with and that you know about in your paragraphs, rather than only using or relying on the quote. Otherwise, I like it. I like the how sort of at the start it's talking about men and sort of talking about the way society expects them to not be vulnerable and not be sort of weak. But then in the second one, it gives a juxtaposition and goes, you know what, actually, though, we do favor emotional displays. So this is an example where it did work to put the quotes in, but I'd probably put in just like my own sort of either examples or I'm going to answer this question that I got sent in the chat, which was, in the introduction, can we start off with a story? Because I got reminded of the story of an author who, by actually showcasing negative views, his book actually did really well. And so I really like that because, yes, absolutely, you can use whatever style of writing you like to convey your points and understanding of the topic. So if you'd like to use an anecdote anywhere, if you'd like to use an example in the intro, if you'd like to use a personal example, if you'd like to use it in the body paragraphs, up to you. Make it yours and make it clear. And so if that's like the clearest, most interesting way you can think of to present your points, by all means, you're welcome to do that. So this is a very, this sample here is a very typical standard style of essay. Nothing wrong with that at all. Definitely can follow that standard teal structure of an essay. But if you feel like you want to write a little bit more freely and that conveys your points better, go for it. And if you're not sure if it's working, you can reach out, ask your tutors, ask your friends to read it, spend some time reflecting, editing, and see if it's making sense for you. Yep, so that's my little part there.
Cool.
Yeah, do you have anything else to add, Vera? Go for it.
Yeah, so if I could just quickly jump in back about your point about the personal story, I actually think that's a really nice way to kind of segue the reader into the topic. I actually think that establishing the theme in the introduction is quite a crucial part of the essay itself. I think that in my own experience, I often spent a lot of time in the actual body paragraphs and not enough time actually establishing a theme. But if you have a very unique idea, a unique angle of the theme in particular that you want to kind of go for, I would definitely spend the time. And, if you have the resources, if you have that personal story, if you have something that you've read about, something that you've watched that really speaks to you about this topic, I would definitely say go for it. And the introduction is a perfect way to kind of talk about that. I did also want to add, I got actually 2 questions asking me pretty much the same thing, but it was just basically that task A supposedly more argumentative and task B supposedly more personal. And as you can see, and as Sarah pointed out before, this essay is written more of an argumentative kind of style, and this is sort of like the more standard style, I suppose, that you would see in task A. I think that that's actually kind of a common misconception that task A is just argumentative or expository and task B is more personal. I think that you can actually mix and match. For me personally, I would do argumentative for both of them, or persuasive for both of them, if you want to call it that. And some people actually go for more of a personal, loose sort of style for task A as well. I think it really depends on you. After all, I don't think that there should be any sort of structural limitations when it comes to writing essays. It shouldn't really hold you back. Yeah, and the advice on keeping up with on putting in more examples is a really good piece of information. I think if you have anything that you've come across that you think fits in nicely with your point, put it in. It makes you seem more well-read, more well-rounded, and yeah, definitely. These themes are definitely applicable to real life. Okay.
Beautiful.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Vera.
Oh, good.
And yeah, if you guys have any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll see, depending on time, if we can answer you later, or you can send us an email. And yeah, I guess like my final little wrap up there would be with section 2, practice so that you can find what works for you. That's probably the key, rather than becoming tricked into thinking that there's a set rule or structure that you must follow, because it's highly flexible. So find out what works for you and play to your strengths. All right, so we'll get started on section 3, very similar to section 1, just in case, again, you haven't done it before. It's more a science-based section, science reasoning specifically. So you'll have 10 questions, also multi-choice, A through D options, and then when you'll have 20 minutes to do it. When you're done, we'll hand it over to Karim, one of our section 3 tutors, and he'll run you through some explanations. Okay, and you can start.
Great, thank you, Sarah. All right, everyone. So I'll start sharing my screen. Can everyone see that? It's all good. Great. So whenever you approach a section 3 question, you really want to start thinking about like your strategy and how you're going to try and sort of calculate or figure things out. Oftentimes, including myself, whenever I see a question like this with a big pathway, I'll start to freak out a little bit. But it's really important to stay calm and approach the question systematically and try and figure out what they really need you to know. So the stem is often overlooked. So whenever you're reading, and I'll zoom in a little bit because we did have, it's a bit blurry. I think. I should be able to just do this. Okay, that's a bit better. Oh, sorry, I'll be looking down as well quite a bit just because I'm using my iPad. Okay, so with this question, starts describing heme metabolism. So heme is a component of hemoglobin, it's found in red blood cells. It's degraded via an enzymatic process involving heme oxygenase. Whenever you're reading a question like this, me personally, I like to highlight things. Obviously, it's going to be a bit of an issue with the... Actually, I don't think it is an issue with the online GAMSAT because I think you guys do have a highlight function. Either way, just try and make sure you look out for key information like enzymatic process involving heme oxygenase. It's converting, there's a conversion of heme to biliverdin. This is the first and rate limiting step in a 2-step reaction. Often when they tell you something is rate limiting, it often does become important. So just keep a lookout for things like that. It also talks about metalloporphyrins, which are a synthetic heme analog, so it can competitively inhibit heme oxygenase activity. Biliverdin can then be reduced to bilirubin via the enzyme bilirubin reductase. Carbon monoxide produced in the breakdown of heme can either activate guanylyl cyclase to form cGMP or displace oxygen to form carboxyhemoglobin. What they've done there is they've stopped talking about bilirubin. They've talked about something slightly separate but related, still within the pathway, and then they go back to talk about bilirubin. Just be aware of them doing things like that, because often in the STEM they won't put everything together in a really nice logical order. They might move things around, so just be aware of that. Anyway, bilirubin is then conjugated in the liver to form bilirubin monoglucuronide and diglucuronide. And then it gives you some sort of figure that you have to analyze. So I'll get rid of that. Great. So the first question is, which of the following reactions most likely takes place in the liver? And it gives you 4 different reactions. This one's basically just a careful reading of the STEM. And I'll have a look to see how you guys did on that. Sorry. So not many people actually got this one right. Let's have a look why. Okay, so if we really carefully read the STEM, we can see that bilirubin it can be conjugated in the liver to form bilirubin monoglucuronide and diglucuronide. So if you see here, that's just this step here. So it's the conjugation of, oh, I see why people didn't pick this one. There's been a bit of an error. So it should have said bilirubin to diglucuronide. Which would be C. I think, yeah, no, that makes much more sense. Yeah, so the correct answer is C. I'm not sure why we've selected the correct answer as D, so sorry about that, everyone. But yeah, the correct answer for that one would be C. But basically in the liver, you have bilirubin being converted or conjugated to form BDG and BMG. D is actually just the wrong way around. So that one's sort of just a bit of a giveaway. It's something just from the STEM. So be aware of those ones. They're really easy points in the GAMSAT if you can get those types of things. Excess breakdown of red blood cells in the body would likely cause an increase in the concentration of blood of which of the following? This is a really interesting question. So if you look here, red blood cells can be broken down through this pathway. And so if there's an increase in red blood cell breakdown, you'd sort of expect everything downstream to be increased, right? So you're going to get increased production of heme, you're going to get increased production of biliverdin, and some of these things here as well. The difference is that these things are in different compartments in the body. So for example, BDG and BMG is mostly being excreted and actually removed from the body. You know, like biliverdin reductase, for example, is an enzyme that's going to be mostly in the liver. So the thing that's going to increase the most in the blood is going to be bilirubin itself. So the correct answer for that one was D, which most of you got. So that was good to see. That was good to see. Okay, for question 3, biliverdin reductase deficiency is likely to result in. So if we go back to the pathway, basically we imagine that this here is not occurring. And so if that's not occurring, we're going to get a sort of buildup of everything behind that and decrease in everything after it. That's what we'd expect to see at least. So if we move down, with this one, an increased degradation of red blood cells. So you wouldn't expect this to occur because everything sort of behind this point, you'd expect to decrease. So if their metabolic waste products are not being removed, you'd expect either a slowing down of red blood cell breakdown, or it just wouldn't change the rate. So maybe there's no feedback mechanism there, but you wouldn't expect it to increase for sure. Increase in heme oxygenase level. Okay, so if we have, let me just double check. Yeah. Okay, so the reason why this is the correct answer is because if biliverdin reductase is not working sufficiently, then there's going to be a buildup of biliverdin, right? Which tells the body that something is not occurring properly in this particular pathway. So typically what would happen is the body would try and upregulate some of these enzymes. And what we actually do see is that there's an increase in heme oxygenase production. So because this thing is not getting removed, your body thinks that there's something wrong with this particular pathway. So it tries to compensate for it. And so that's why that one there is the correct answer. Okay, move on to question 4. So reduction reactions and heme breakdown include which of the following? So with this one, what you really needed to note was that in the STEM, they told you that conversion of heme to biliverdin is the first and rate limiting step in a 2-step reaction, which requires NAPDH and oxygen. From that, you can sort of learn that anything involving NAPDH is going to be a reduction reaction. So if you didn't already know that, you can sort of figure that out. So then you look at the diagram and you see that this reaction involves NADPH and also this reaction here. So it would make sense that the conversion of biliverdin to bilirubin is also a reduction reaction. Which, if we look down here, we would expect that that is possibly one of the answers. Yeah, heme to biliverdin is one of them. So yeah, heme to biliverdin or biliverdin to bilirubin. We'd expect one of those two to be the correct answer. So in this case, it was B. Great. Okay, in question 5, they've set up an experiment where they're trying to test different types of metalloporphins. In the experiment, they're drawing a specific amount of blood from mice, and then the sample is centrifuged, and then you extract red blood cells. And the red blood cells are last for their heme content. The question is sort of asking which of the factors must be kept constant in the experiment described above in order to test the efficacy of different types of metalloporphins. So with this question, it's sort of tricky because you have to imagine yourself as the experimenter and trying to conduct this sort of experiment. Would you change the amount of heme oxygenase you're adding? Possibly. The reason why you might possibly like to change that is you might like to see how well the drugs work when there's different concentrations of heme oxygenase present. So it is possible that you might change the amount of heme oxygenase you're adding. You won't necessarily want to keep that constant. With B, the type of metalloporphins used or tested, you will want to change that because the whole point of the experiment is to try and test sort of different types of metalloporphins. So definitely not B. C, the content of myoglobin present. Now, if you look really carefully at this diagram, you can see there's 2 pathways which produce heme. So there's this pathway here and this pathway here. The second pathway involves myoglobin. So if in the experiment that you're performing, you had different samples with different levels of heme in them, what would occur is that you'd get a lot of variation in your results. So you want to sort of eliminate any contribution from this secondary pathway here. Hence the correct answer in this particular case is C. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. I think I saw we had some, saw something in the chat. 5 to 7 minutes. Yep, I'll try to move quickly through this one, Sarah. Thank you. So this one here is about voltage amplifiers. I'll move straight on to the questions. So for question 1, Which of the four amplifiers in figure 1 has the highest voltage gain? What you need to figure out from the question is that voltage gain literally just means the gradient on the graph of any of these things. So the one with the highest voltage gain is also the one with the highest gradient or the sharpest gradient. So in that case, it's going to be D. So the correct answer for that one was D, which I think a lot of you probably would have got. Yep, really good. So yeah, just the sharpest gradient for that one. It's basically, if you can interpret that from the stem, it should be pretty easy to figure out. Question 2, which of the amplifiers in figure 1 can amplify the greatest range of voltage input? So once again, just look really carefully at the graph and that you'll see that all of these have a cutoff after which they won't sort of amplify anymore. Whereas in B, it's sort of a straight line the whole time. So it has the greatest range through which you can amplify something. So in that case, B is going to be the correct answer. What are the voltage gains of amplifier A and D respectively? If you figured out already that voltage gain just means gradient, then all you have to do is figure out the gradient of those two. So for A, the way I would do it personally is I would start at 0 and I would trace down for A. And A looks about to be 300 versus 6. So the rise is going to be 6, but this is in volts, so I have to convert it to millivolts. So that'd be 6,000 over 300, which when you divide it out is going to equal 20. And then you do the exact same thing for D. So I think it was for D anyway. Yep, for D. Actually, did I mess that up? Oops, sorry, no, I sort of messed that up. I kind of misread it. So A, sorry, was about 400 versus 6. So that should be 6,000 on 400, which will give 15. So be careful to read the graph, I guess. There's another thing to look out for. And then you do the exact same thing for D, which was 2,000 versus 100. There's 100 there, 2 there. So the gradient in that case is going to be 20. So that one's pretty easy. Once again, these are just like, make sure you interpret the stem first before moving on to the questions. If you figured out that voltage gain is literally just the gradient, then you can pretty much get at least 2 out of these 5 questions correct. This one's probably the most tricky, I thought, personally. So for this one, you're putting in a particular input, which was this input. Oh. So you're putting in this input, and then you're getting a particular output based on the amplification from one of these here. All you really have to do is match the input, so each point along here, to whatever value it is on volts, and then see what the output is going to give. So what these things would give as an output once they amplify. But basically, you would note, what you really needed to notice is that because it's amplifier C, once you put in with amplifier C, which is this one here, once you go above about 300 millivolts, it's not going to amplify any further. So there's going to be a nice plateau at about 300 millivolts. So if you go down, at the very least, what that tells you is that the answer is going to be either B or C, because whenever it gets to 300 millivolts, there's going to be a cutoff, basically. The difference between B and C is that C has the correct units on the y-axis. It actually amplifies it up to volts, whereas then with B, the units are not quite right. So they're a factor of 10 off. That's the major difference. So the correct answer is C for that one. I'm guessing that might have been a bit challenging for people. Oh no, quite a lot of you got that right, which is really good. So yeah, I think a lot of people would have accidentally clicked B because it's not the correct unit. So you have to be really careful with looking at units in the GAMSAT, because they always like to trick you on units. And then the last one, I think it's meant to be kind of scary, but all it really is that it's kind of a formula and you need to solve the formula. So they're asking you for the RMS. So logically, the first thing you do is rearrange for RMS. So you get RMS is equal to the peak amplitude divided by the square root of 2. So your next goal is figuring out what the peak amplitude is going to be. So you've got amplifier B, you put in the signal, and you want to know what the peak amplitude is going to be. So if we go to here, the peak input that we're putting in is 0.6. For amplifier B, that's going to be right here. So it's giving off a voltage of 5. Right, I hope everyone can sort of see that. So if it's giving off a voltage of 5, that tells you that that's your peak amplitude. So your peak amplitude is going to be 5, and then you're dividing by the square root of 2. And they've told you what the square root of 2 is. So the square root of 2 is roughly 1.4. So what you do is you say 5 divided by 1.4. It's equal to 50 divided by 14, which is roughly 3.5. Like just very rough. So that's going to be B. That's your correct answer. And I wonder how you guys did on that one. So that would have been another sort of tricky one, purely just because it looks a little bit scary, rather than it actually being difficult. Yes, quite a lot of people got that right as well, which is really good. Yeah, so I think you guys went a bit better with that one compared to the other one. But yeah, did anyone have any questions about those? If not, I can pass back to Sarah.
Cool, we're seeing some thumbs up. Thank you so much, Karim. So actually what I'm going to do is, if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If you have questions after tonight or just in general, you're also welcome to email me. I'm not sure if it's on these slides, but it's sarah@haladtohealth.org. So very easy to remember. I'll put it in the chat as well. But I'm going to hand over to Eliza now. While she goes through a few things, I would love for you guys to type in the chat one thing that you got out of sitting this mock this evening.
Perfect. Yes, that is definitely the, oh, I'm on mute. Oh no, I'm not on mute. Okay, terrific. Thanks. Thanks so much, Karim, Vera, and Sarah. I can probably say on behalf of everyone, thank you so much for all of your feedback and all that insight through the content. This is definitely something which a lot of our students who come through our intensives say that they would not have done if they did not do the intensives. And that is the commitment to reflecting on what you learned every time you sit a piece of GAMSAT prep. So to keep yourselves accountable, to consolidate your learnings from today and the last 2 hours of prep that you've put into this exam, in the chat, put in the thing that you've learned, whether it's through how you approach the exam now or content specific things, and they'll be amazing to share with everyone. And whilst you do that, I'll just go through some things. So generally, we love just to put out 3 things that all of our students from our intensive say that they wanted, and that's pretty much how we make all of our resources. So I've put a few links in the chat below. And if you haven't already, make sure you join our Facebook community. We have an open GAMSAT group as well as a Facebook page, both of which will give you a ton of free resources. If you just scroll through, we put all of the links there to masterclasses, to our 8-week content challenge, which by the way, week 1 has already gone out, but you can still sign up for that. Essentially, we give you content each week to make sure you have consistent practice on your own. And we also have med interview master skills skills workshop coming up this Saturday if you're someone who will be sitting med interviews soon. So make sure you join that Facebook community because that's where we share everything. The second is just to make sure that you know where upcoming events are and when it's happening so you don't miss a thing. We have made an interactive calendar so you can just click on whatever you want to attend and go from there. So that's the second link. And I guess the third one is if you're really getting serious about putting some more time into your GAMSAT preparation, especially as it's coming towards the end of those semester breaks and you're going into the September sitting. Now that you also know the timeline of the September GAMSAT, if you want to enroll in the 6-week intensives, they have started to launch and the first intensives will start on the 4th of August. These are basically 6 weeks of classes back to back. You'll have 2 hours of an online class each week, plus heaps of content, heaps of homework where you can practice on each week. Each class is a maximum of 10 students and it's super affordable at about $189 per intensive, and there is a discount if you sign up with a friend. But what I can say to these intensives now is the first cohort that's gone through them, now we know that they have all done incredibly well, and we've even knuckled down to make them even better. So for instance, Pravind, who has been one of our students, has scored, improved by like 20 points at a time. And that's just insane to see the amount of growth that you can have in really knuckling down in 6 weeks. In that link that I've sent below as well, there is an option to also opt into some mock exams if you want really concentrated practice on content. But it will all be very similar to the questions that we've had today. The mini mock today has actually come from some of the difficult discriminating questions that we've had in last season's mock exams so that you guys were able to sit that. So it's a very sort of similar taste going into your September mock exams. And for all of our participants today and everyone who's come along, we do appreciate you guys coming and supporting us, and to help you guys with your study. If you're really serious about joining those intensives or those mocks, you can always use the promo code MINIMOCK 2.0, which will let us know that you've joined this mock exam, and for section 2 response that you've created today, we'll give you some time to write a full response to that, and we'll have a few section 2 tutors cross mark that and give you some feedback on your section 2 before you start your intensives or the mock exams. So would love to see you guys on the other end, and love to see you at some intensives or mock exams at any point, or even just the med interview stuff. But absolutely best of luck going forward, and we hope to see you again. Thanks for joining.